Good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to our session, which is organized jointly with the European Commission. We have also some representatives from civil society and we have a representative from UN. So we hope it's going to be very interesting for everybody. And it's on the topic of the greening of the recovery process in the EU and also from the global perspective. We have with us today 4 panelists. So we have to start off Ms. Sabine Burti, Head of Unit for Environmental Mainstreaming from DG Environment. Sabine has been for a long time working in the green recovery process from the side of DG Environment, but also has a wide experience from the regional policy from her previous posting in the commissions, but also in the field. We have a second panelist who will be joining us slightly later, which is Madam Paula Abreu Marquez. Paula is a Deputy Director and a Head of Unit in DG Energy, has a long-term experience in the energy field and is responsible for the coordination between institutions, but also coordination of the energy policy and the relation and outreach to the member states. As our next panelist, we have Mr. Dan Thompson from the CE Bankwatch Network. It is a coalition of environmental NGOs who monitor the impact of the EU funds on investments on the climate and environment in Central and Eastern Europe. Since February, Dan has been working on the recovery process and following it from the side of biodiversity and nature protection and their reflection in the recovery and resilience plans. And last but not least, we have Mr. Stephen Stone, who has a long-term experience in the field of environmental and resource economics. Stephen is currently the Chief of UN Environment's Resource and Market Branch, and he directs a team dedicated to furthering knowledge base, outreach, and support to countries on environmental resource economics. Before we start with the session today, I would also like to ask everybody of you to not be shy and join us in our chat. We have a Slido application which is opened, as it is the case for the other GreenWeek sessions. So simply log in the Slido instruments, type in the code EU GreenWeek 2021, and through our session, we will try to react as to many of you as possible. We have some presentation prepared, but even if we cannot really answer all the questions, they still serve as a very important input into our work and into our reflections further on. So I would encourage all of you to send questions or comments as you feel free through the session. So I think we can now proceed with the opening of our session on the green recovery. The topic is very relevant because obviously, as we are all feeling to a certain extent, greater or lesser, the impact of the currently still ongoing COVID crisis, I think this topic might be interesting to a wide range of participants, civil society, national authorities, member states, and so on. The session today will be oriented on the particular instrument which has been part of the EU recovery and the direct response to the COVID crisis. I would maybe ask for the loading of the first presentation. And in the meantime, I can see also that Paula Abreu Marquez will be joining us, and she's coming to joining the session. So if I could please ask for the first opening presentation to be uploaded, and we can start. In the meantime, then I will continue with my introduction. So the recovery process is part of the or the recovery process that we are talking about here today is basically a way how European Union has decided to respond to the COVID crisis. I'm still waiting for the presentation, which is not coming. But as long as, or at the same time as approving, it's thank you very much. So now you can see also the slides that are accompanying. So at the same time as approving its long-term budget, the EU has decided to attach to it a package which is directly dedicated to the recovery process. Let me change the slide. This direct response is called can be seen under the name of Next Generation EU. So it is a temporary instrument which is supposed to boost the recovery and directly contribute as a first help to member states to react to the crisis. You can see here the amount of money which is dedicated in this particular recovery and resilience facility to the recovery process. These prices are from the 2018, so the current prices would be slightly more elevated, but you can see also that the amount of money is divided into two packages, so member states can benefit from grants and they can also benefit from loans. One of the conditions which was decided by the European Council was that the recovery process also has to contribute to a green transition and has to contribute to a digital transition. How member states can access this money, or what is actually behind the process of the recovery? In order to be able to have access, member states, or each member state, has to prepare what is called recovery and resilience plan. In these plans, member states can clearly show their needed reforms and investments, which are presented under measures. The package, which has been prepared in the form of the recovery plan, is then forwarded to the European Commission for an assessment. And after such assessment is finished, then it is up to the Council of the European Union. So again, the member states in the Council formation will be then approving each individual of these plans and therefore giving a green light for the money or for the support to the individual member states. You can see also on the slide how the money will be divided. So there will be an upfront payment of 13%, and then the rest of the money will be disbursed based on milestones and targets which member states do set in their individual plans. The idea is that this money is supposed to be really very direct, very short-term support between the years 2021 up to 2026. So this is the framework for the recovery process, and this is something we have been very intensely working on as a Commission with the member states. But now the question which we want to ask ourselves today is how much of this money can be done, or how can it be ensured that these national plans are green or are contributing to the green transition and the sustainability. So I will now give a floor to Sabine to continue with the question for the greening.
Thank you very much, Marcella, for setting the frame and the timeline of this recovery. And I would indeed like now to focus really on the green transition element, and more specifically how the EU will support the greening of the recovery plan. And as time is short, I really would like to insist on the two, what we consider the two main driver of this greening, which are twofold. First, the necessity and to raise the level of ambition in terms of green investment. And this is why we have this target of 37% in the regulation that should apply to all member state plan as climate tagging. This high level of green investment is one of the main drivers, but the second one, which is also very important, is that we also pay attention to the rest of the investment. So to ensure that the rest of the investment will not harm the environment, and this will take place thanks to the do no significant harm principle implementation, which is, as you may know, inspired by the taxonomy regulation, Article 17, which is very clear in the Resilience and Recovery Facility regulation. No plan will be endorsed by the Commission and assessed positively if it harms any of the 6 environmental objectives of the taxonomy regulation. So this is really the 2 main drivers that are today contributing to the greening of the plans. And these drivers will be applied to all reforms and investment in the plan. And so each plan will be screened at the light of these two key elements. And how this will take place more concretely in practice. First, what is important in terms of tagging is that we have the same, I would say, we treat the member state on an equal footing, and this is why we have a very clear methodology in the regulation, which is based on the Rio marker and which has been already experienced in the cohesion policy under the current programming period. It has been, of course, improved and enlarged. And more concretely, based on this methodology and the different intervention field, the member state has to choose intervention fields. For this intervention field, there are different possibility of tagging. From 100% if it fully benefits to, or principally benefit to climate, 40% if it's only significant, or if it has no impact, then it will be tagged as 0. And then the member states choose the field of intervention, and then of course it combines the coefficient with the cost estimated, and then this aggregated measures by measures give you the total per plan. And same methodology is applied for digital tagging as well. So this is the way it is implemented. And in case of doubt, or if the Commission does not agree, there is a dialogue with the member state. There are also possibility to have, I would say, some measures or some activities that are out of the field of the regulation. All this is possible. What is important is really that the contribution to climate is effective, and then it can enter into this 37% tagging. The second driver that I mentioned earlier, this do no significant harm principle that applies to all expenditure, is of course derived from the European Green Deal, but much from the taxonomy regulation. And as I was mentioning before, it will apply to all measures in the recovery plan. And what is important here is that we have whether the situation where the plan is fully compliant with the do no significant harm principle vis-à-vis of the 6 taxonomy objective, meaning climate mitigation, climate adaptation, circular economy, zero pollution, water and biodiversity. So once the measure has been screened with regard to all these 6 objectives, there is no harm. Or there may be also a situation where the member states need to foresee for some measures to have some step in the implementing process to ensure that the compliance with do no significant harm principle will be met. So it can be, for instance, by putting condition for the call for proposal. It can be also for the time for later on for the implementation process. For instance, if a project has to go through an EIA, mitigating measures may be planned, and all this must be complied with at the time of the milestone. So when the first payment claim will reach the Commission. So this is really important that it is in order for really each measures. And the result so far is quite positive, because following the dialogue with the member states, there's been a number of, I would say, harmful projects or measures that have been already excluded from the plan. If we take, for instance, projects such as incinerators, there were some at the very beginning in the draft plans. All of them have been now, to our knowledge, excluded, but we're still, of course, in a negotiation process. So just to show that this is really not a principle in the air, but really something which will have to be implemented. And the Commission has, of course, guided the member state to do so. Dedicated notice has been adopted by the Commission in February, so that the member state have the full awareness on how this principle should be translated into the plans. And what is interesting also with the principle, which is one of the 11 criteria that the Commission will use to assess the plan and is using, because we are in this process by now, is that it's a criteria that applies at the level of the measure. It's not something that you look globally in the plan, but really it will be screened out measures by measures. And whether the Commission will be satisfied with the compliance, whether it will not be satisfied. So whether we will have a ranking positive, ranking A, or a negative ranking, but there is no middle range ranking, no B ranking. And so even, I would say, through a negative assessment of one measures, a plan could be assessed negatively by the Commission. So this is very powerful on all measures, and then globally on the assessment that the Commission will deliver on the plan. Coming to the example of green reform and investment that we are seeing, or that we would like to see in the adopted recovery plan by the Council, we see a lot of reform and investment in the transport sector and in the energy sector. And I'm very happy that Paola Abreu is with us today to give more insight on the energy sector, but transport is one of the main items for the green transition investment, with a lot of investment going to electrification of transport, alternative mode of transport, clean urban transport. All this is very positive also for clean air in the city. So these are reforms that we have seen so far, but also reform linked to the decarbonization of industry, also for incentivizing circular economy practices in the enterprises. More also reform touching upon agricultural practices with a support to organic farming practices, support to a nature-based solution, which is very important also as the green transition should include biodiversity dimension in the plan, and support to a lot of other reforms that are positive for environmental investments, such as green taxation. Time is very short for me to describe all this in 10 minutes, but I would be very pleased to take on board questions and leave now maybe a space for the other speaker to give their feedback on that. Marcella, the floor is back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Sabine, for showing us actually the green element of this recovery process and how member states can provide for the greening already at this moment direct support to environment. and how also it is important to see that it is not only environment, but it is more about all these other policies actually that have to be scrutinized through the help of this do no significant harm in terms of their impact on the environment. But as we have heard in your presentation, energy is actually one of the most prominent areas where the support will be targeted. So I would like to invite Paula, and good afternoon to you. You have joined us slightly later, but we are very happy that you could. And I would like to invite you to proceed with your views on how actually the energy sector is prepared for the greening transition, and what does it actually mean, greening, from your perspective.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to join. Sorry for the connection problem at the beginning. I'm very pleased, and also very pleased that energy is one of the focal areas for the recovery funds. So in my presentation, I will share with you, and I would like the colleagues to put on the slides, share with you the how we see these and what does it mean, this green recovery from an energy point of view. So I think we all agree that the energy sector offers clear opportunities to deliver both on our ambitious goals for a successful green and resilient recovery, and also to achieve the climate neutrality by 2050 that you may know is well enshrined now in legislation. And this includes also that there is a big milestone that needs to be achieved, which is to get to at least 55% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030. This was endorsed also with the European climate law, and for that we are revising some key important pieces of legislation as part of the Fit for 55 package that many of you may know that the Commission is preparing. We are in ultimate stages of preparation, and it will put on the table in July. It includes the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive, when we look just exclusively at energy, but it's a big package of 12 proposals. And then later on in the year, we'll be joining with other revisions and new proposals, like the revision of the Buildings Directive, very important also from the recovery point of view, methane emission reduction regulation, and the hydrogen and gas decarbonization package. So this later in the year. Here on energy, what we are already seeing is that there is an incredible decline in greenhouse gas emissions, and we have to bear in mind that energy represents 75% of all this energy. I mean, energy consumption and production is 75% of emissions. So it's an important sector to work on if you want to tackle climate issues. We see new records in wind and solar generation in EU, but also across the world. We see a very intensified coal to gas fuel switching, and we also see a very interesting development, which is the true empowerment of energy consumer who becomes self-consumer and also is joining other consumers and generators in what we call the renewable energy communities, and these are flourishing across all the member states. So this is what we see happening, but looking specifically at the subject today, how best to achieve this? And we see that the energy sector investment needs are on the increase. This relates to buildings, to power grids, to generation, to the transport. They all require significant investments. And we estimate that the average annual investment in the energy system altogether will need something per year like 350 billion euros, and higher than what and this for this decade, 2021-2030, and these are what we need in addition to what we have invested in the last decade, so until 2020. And of course, the Recovery and Resilience Facility is our central tool for supporting recovery, but also we see this as an incredible instrument for boosting the green transition. So we already heard about huge amounts, and it will be available in terms of grants and loans for the member states to make the economies and societies much more sustainable, resilient, and better prepared for the future. We heard in Sabine's presentation, the climate tagging, so 37% of these funds, and this means almost 250 billion euros is an important amount, will have to be channeled into climate-related investments and reforms, and these include obviously energy, includes green energy projects in the field of renewables, energy efficiency, the renovation of buildings, looking at the energy aspects, alternative fuel infrastructure, new clean technologies like renewable hydrogen. And the plans, the national plans that everybody talks about, the recovery and resilience plans, constitute a unique opportunity for the member states to front load the necessary investments and the reforms that will accelerate this transition and facilitate, as I said at the beginning, the climate and energy targets. And so this is why we look so much with so much attention and what's happening with these plans and the way member states wish to allocate the funds. Of course, it's what we see in these plans, the recovery plans, have also to be, let's say, in line and address the challenges that have been identified in the country-specific recommendations of the European semester. And also, when it comes to energy, we see a very clear link with existing national energy and climate plans that have been set for 2021-2030, and also the just transition plans, territorial just transition plans that start to be submitted by some member states now, and we'll see more to come in the months ahead. So just a way to say also that the Commission has been supporting member states quite a lot in the preparation of these national resilience and recovery plans, and this since October 2020, so last year. Next slide, please. I mean, talking about concrete examples of initiatives and projects and also reforms relevant to energy. So we heard about 7 flagships. So these are the ones identified in the recovery context. And we see that 3 out of these 7 are energy related. These are the power up, so power generation, renovation of buildings, and the third one is recharge and refuel. So all 3 very important. And in these slides, you see a comprehensive list of projects, but I think the slide is not the correct one. Could you go backwards, please? Because I wanted just to see the list of projects that are eligible. Do you have that? I don't see it. No, before that. I'm still in one before. Yes, that's fine. Okay. So in the case of the power up, so the aim really is to be able to front load clean technologies and accelerate the deployment of renewables. And this can have important impacts also in terms of employment, since the sector itself employs over 1.5 million people and has an important turnover. So we see the funding, the recovery funding to support investments in renewables, and this includes also electrolyzers for hydrogen. We see investments in transmission and distribution grids, also in storage and flexibility solutions. So these components can also support investments that enable the energy system integration, and just as way of an example, for instance, through the expansion of electromobility, so zero-emission vehicles. Power Up offers very good opportunities to be reflected then in the plans. In the case of Renovate, buildings are an important energy consuming sector. It represents about 40% of the final energy consumption in the EU, and therefore there is a lot to gain there, both in terms of energy efficiency, renewables mainstreaming, but also, of course, emissions. And so this is why Renovate has been put as one of the 7 flagships. And as well, it's a sector, the building renovation is one of the most job-creating areas of investment across the entire green energy transition. For instance, the International Energy Agency has estimated that something like 10 to 15 local jobs, and I'd like to underline the local aspect, can be created per every million euro that is invested. So it's an interesting figure and an interesting sector to invest in the context of renovation. The aim is that by 2025, these funds should help member states to double the rate of renovations. This is a very challenging area, as you may realized, given the old building stock that generally we find across the member states. So it's doubling is a big challenge. And although the figures based on the assessment of the plans that we have seen so far are preliminary, we see that the energy renovation, the clean power, I mean, they get a big chunk of the financial envelope in terms of the intentions of the member states, and we are very happy with that. Same goes for transport. Actually, transport all alone is over 40% of what we have seen of the budget investment intentions, and this is as Sabine referred, very linked as well to the electrification of transport. Yeah, I mean, of course, we are looking usually very much to the investment side of the plans, but I would like to say that we attach the similar importance to the part of reforms. So as you know, this is also the second part of the plans. The member states have also to include reforms, and this is extremely important when it comes to energy, because they can reinforce the effectiveness of each euro that is invested. So and here when we talk about energy, we see that there is ample room to improve everything related to removing investment barriers and creating the enabling conditions for the private investment to step in, to come in. So here we see examples of reform that we see include the simplification and the shortening of permitting processes, streamlining administrative procedures, setting up one-stop shops, which is extremely useful for investors, for the project promoters, fiscal incentives. We also have planning of auctions, also make sure that there is a coordination between generation capacity on renewables and the development of the grid for an adequate integration. So there are a number of reforms that we see, and these are all very welcome. And again, as I said before, this is a way to ensure that the effects of the investments prolong in the future. Next slide. Looking at financing sources, I'd like just here to say that, of course, recovery and resilience plans and the recovery funds are a very important stepping stone in the process and this energy transition. But member states need much more and to go beyond these plans. And several financial tools and programs are in place to make that happen. We have an historical financial package that includes the EU budget in the next generation EU, making available 1.8 trillion euros, and as you know, 30% of all these funds have to be spent on achieving environment and climate ambitions. So again, here we have a very good focus on energy. So here I will not go into details because I don't want to exceed too much my time, but would like perhaps to signal the Invest EU that will bring, for instance, a new strategic investment facility, and this will reinforce the strategic autonomy and resilience of the European economy in some key areas, including on critical infrastructure, also related to energy, but also enabling transformative green and digital technology, so also things related to game-changing innovations. And includes also renewable energy storage, batteries, clean hydrogen, and fuel cells. So there is an important focus there for energy and energy renewables. We also have, I'd like to mention the just transition mechanism. So, and this addressing the social and economic effects of the transition and focusing on the regions, industries, and the workers who will face the greatest challenges in this transition. And this mobilizes an important amount of budget and includes various instruments like the Just Transition Fund, but also the Just Transition Scheme. And a public sector loan facility. Important to mention that under this support to specific regions that will suffer the most with the transition. We look at regions, for instance, coal regions in transition and others, and there is an important focus also on energy efficiency, notably in the building sector and renewables generation. We have the Horizon Europe when it comes to research and technology innovation, and then we have a whole series of other instruments. Again, 30% of the whole cake has to go to climate and environment and energy related support, so which all go in the same direction. And perhaps just my last slide. Of course, the clean energy transition will cut emissions, will reduce the pollution, will improve our health, but the impacts go much beyond climate and environmental benefits. As I said at the beginning, it has a strong potential to create jobs, durable jobs, local jobs, and to boost growth. It also helps to improve our resilience in terms of energy security, since it will result in reduced dependency on imports of fossil fuels. And going back to the jobs, I leave here with a nice chart that indicates for each type of sector within energy what is the direct and indirect impact in terms of jobs. I think it's interesting. For instance, solar power could generate something like 400,000 new direct and indirect jobs, and this alongside the whole industrial value chain by 2030. And if we compare, for instance, with the coal industry, it currently employs less than 200,000 people in Europe. So just to give you an order of magnitude here. So, and overall, we estimate that going climate neutral will be able to create more than 2 million jobs in the EU, and these have to be considered to be high quality, future-proof jobs that will also bring good revenues to the local communities. So this is what we call also in the sense that even if the climate neutrality will benefit all Europe, all Europeans, of course, as I said before, there are some people, regions, and industries that will need support to get there and to create new opportunities. And this is what we call the just transition. So the Green Deal promised not to leave anybody behind. So I will leave it here. I mean, there are many things I would like to say in terms of examples of investments that you have seen, very good things, both in terms of investments in the power up, in the renovate flagships coming in the member states plans, and also on the reform side. I mentioned some during the presentation, and of course I will be very happy to come back on it if you have questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula. It is very interesting, actually, and we can see that we should have probably dedicated an entire maybe day to the recovery process. So in order to give the opportunity also to our other speakers, because we have also quite a lot of questions, but in order to give opportunity to our other speakers, I would now like to invite Dan, please, to also make a shift between, okay, we have these traditional heavy industries that need to undergo through certain transition, but then we also very much support the inclusion of these nature-based solution. And what is actually the status of biodiversity protection with the new biodiversity strategy being out? So please, Dan, if you could go ahead and share with us your view on the recovery process from your perspective.
Yes, thank you, Marcella, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to give a quick presentation on nature and biodiversity in the recovery funds, specifically why we need more investments coming from the recovery funds in these areas. I'm also going to speak briefly about our recent report, which assesses 10 Central and Eastern European recovery plans and specifically looks at what measures and proposals are in these plans in order to meet the biodiversity strategy for 2030 objectives. Next slide, please. So I just want to start by outlining why we really need a nature positive recovery and why we do need to factor in biodiversity and nature into these recovery fund processes. So there are a few reasons. The first being that the recovery funds are really a key objective to deliver on the biodiversity strategy for 2030. So the biodiversity strategy for 2030 was released last year. It was very ambitious, but very commendable. It set in motion some very strong objectives. For example, it called for 20 billion a year in private and public funding to biodiversity, 30% of land and sea should be protected by 2030, as well as the improved implementation of EU directives. And the Recovery Fund is really a golden opportunity to start these investments to really deliver and achieve the biodiversity strategy objectives that we urgently need. I think it's worth mentioning too the reform tool, the reform element of the recovery funds. That's obviously a very unique tool that other EU funding streams just don't have. And in this context, the reform angle can really be used to, for example, increase or deliver the implementation of the EU directives that other funding streams just don't have. I think it's also important to note here that the biodiversity strategy for 2020 that's just been was only partly achieved. And there's the risk that without these increased funds coming from the Recovery Fund, that the biodiversity strategy for 2030 objectives won't be achieved in the next decade unless we have significant funds and investments starting today. Also want to highlight the economic case for increasing funding for biodiversity and nature, specifically within the recovery funds. So our economies are so dependent now on the health of nature that the cost of inaction is actually far higher than the investments needed to safeguard it. There's also a huge job potential actually with jobs in biodiversity and nature protection. The Natura 2000 sites, for every 1 billion invested in these sites, actually create 30,000 jobs. As is with nature-based solutions too, they're an incredibly strong funding source. And so too, we really need a more resilient and to build a greater resilience for future pandemics. Another key reason we should increase investments in this field is also the climate aspect. So we often see climate and nature being separate from each other, completely distinct and independent, but we should really be seeing these as two things that should be tackled together. Climate change is obviously a key driver of nature and biodiversity destruction, but nature can really help deliver on some of the climate objectives. Just to give an example, investments in nature-based solutions can actually deliver at least 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions for 2030. So we should stop seeing nature and climate as two separate things, and we should really focus on both of them being mutually beneficial for each other. Next slide, please. Oh, back one. Yeah. So I'd just like to share a few key findings from our assessments of the recovery plans, specifically for biodiversity and nature conservation. So the first one is that almost no measures are actually proposed for biodiversity and nature within these plans. So just to quantify this slightly better, less than 0.3% of all the 10 countries that we analysed are actually, less than 0.3% of the funds of the 10 countries we analysed will actually go towards biodiversity. Or put in a slightly different way, that's less than 3 cents per every euro invested will actually go to nature and biodiversity. We're seeing that the 37% climate earmarking, which is pretty strong, even though there's a clause here which says member states should also include biodiversity in this 37%, that's not obligatory, which means that it's entirely down to the political will of the member states to include measures for biodiversity and nature. We've also found that there's a lack of information available to the public on the DNSH assessments made by member states. I think that's particularly important because we've seen some potentially harmful proposals, specifically relating to irrigation practices. And this is where we really need to see the DNSH assessments conducted by member states, just to see the impact on nature that these proposals could potentially entail. We also thought that this could perhaps also breach the Aarhus regulation, which is obviously designed to ensure that the public has access to information when they think environmental breaches could happen. We've also found that funding for biodiversity through other funding streams isn't guaranteed at all. So in some cases, member states, the national budget for improving biodiversity and nature has actually been reduced, and there's absolutely no guarantee that they will actually invest more money for biodiversity and nature. Another key thing is that the priority action frameworks that outline the network Natura 2000 sites, the funding needs for these sites, they ultimately come from EU funds, but these aren't guaranteed at all, which means that the EU recovery funds, which of course are guaranteed at this point, can really make a huge difference here. We also find that a lot of member states also rely entirely on the EU biodiversity strategy because they have no national framework in place, which means that it's even more important that the EU biodiversity strategy objectives are achieved and delivered because in some cases there is no national framework in place. Next slide, please. Another key thing we think is incredibly important during the whole process is public participation. We've found that the RF process has really highlighted the importance of public participation. So we found that when civil society and public and stakeholders have been involved throughout the process, the quality and the environmental and in climate ambition has really increased. And conversely, when the public and civil society hasn't been able to provide input to these plans, the ambition has not been good at all, comparatively. We've also found that many feasible proposals from NGOs that were not considered in favour of potentially harmful ones that do not align with the EU climate environmental targets. And perhaps on a more positive note, the emphasis should now be that on the increased need for public participation during the later implementation stages for monitoring. That concludes my short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Actually, it is very important to share also this view and the view from the other angle on the issue. And let's hope that actually the final results for the final plans, because I understand a lot of your work also has been done in this preparatory stage. So because we have been really working with the member states on all the levels, let's hope that the final results are a little bit more optimistic than actually as this initial analysis from your side is showing. And because we are running again slightly out of time, I would also like to give the floor to our last panelist, Stephen Stone. Stephen, we have presented here a wide range of issues and initiatives that the EU is doing on its side in order to, let's say, get out of the pandemics greener and really step up to this sustainable new way of economy. How would you see this to be done in the global sector? How does it connect with what the world is doing?
Thank you so much, Marcella. It's wonderful to have an inside view of what the Commission is doing in all the European member states, because it is a heroic challenge. I mean, the lockdown, the pandemic itself, it shifted everything. And so I have a few slides with some data, but Dan also really enjoyed your presentation, learning about some of the challenges on biodiversity. I'll move fairly quickly. The point is here, prosperity. It's about creating the conditions for prosperity, but keeping people and the planet in the picture. Next slide. Many of you who are following the pandemic know this slide already. It's a once-in-a-generation hit to our economies, to our growth. There's never been this many countries in recession at the same time, or this deep of a contraction, not at least in our lifetimes. You have to go back to the Great Depression, essentially. So we are in uncharted territory. And on top of that, we're adopting monetary policies, which are also in uncharted territory. So we're using all fiscal devices, fiscal weapons like the Commission is doing, but also monetary policy to attack this problem. Next slide, please. Here, I don't need to dwell on this because Paula, you've spoken to this, and you, Sabine, as well. There are very strong reasons to invest greener. They're job creating, they're nature supporting, they're life supporting investments. In this picture, you see some of the data that showed up from the Hepburn et al. Study, the Oxford Smith School, that was produced with Lord Stern and Joe Stiglitz last year. And basically on the back of this study, which looks at growth multipliers and climate multipliers from different investment possibilities, you come to those 5 areas that Sabine, both you and Paula talked about. So clean mobility, clean energy, building retrofits, R&D, connectivity, digital connectivity, and then also natural capital. So what you were talking about, Dan, those are really the top 5 in terms of what the literature is pointing to for job creation and prosperity creation. Next slide, please. We did some research with Oxford Smith on the back of that paper, which looks at spending announcements across the entire world, so the top 50 economies. And this was actually a report that we published in March of this year, and it's live. You can actually go to this data set. If you Google Global Recovery Observatory, you'll get it. It's real time. So every spending announcement that comes through is posted there. It's currently, it was 14.6 trillion back in March. It's now around 16.2 trillion. The lion's share of this was for rescue. So it didn't have anything to do with recovery per se. It was really just keeping businesses afloat, keeping families afloat. The fraction that went to recovery was quite small. It was around 2 trillion back in March. And of that 2 trillion, only 341 billion was green, could be qualified as green. So a very relatively small amount. And just to put that number into perspective, that's around the average year's worth of fossil fuel subsidies, around $350 billion a year. Next slide, please. Well, if you toggle through, it's a little bit small probably, but this is the proportion of green recovery spending to total recovery spending. And of that 341 billion, a lot of the front runners are actually located in Europe. So it's Europe plus China, interestingly enough, plus South Korea, that have the highest levels, the volumes of green recovery spending. Next slide, please. Yeah, and gosh, it's very small. So I recommend that you go to the website, the Global Recovery Observatory website, and you will see an updated version of this graph, which essentially carves up the space into 4 quadrants. On the x-axis, you have recovery spending and spending as a percentage of GDP. So the farther you out on the x-axis, the more the country is spending to recover. The higher you are on the vertical axis, the greener it is. So as you move to the upper right quadrant, you're getting a lot of green spending. You're getting a lot of spending and a lot of it's green. And in that upper right-hand quadrant, what we call the green leaders, you have countries like Germany, like Finland, like Denmark, but also some surprises as well. Poland, Spain are also quite close to that quadrant. Below that, you have countries that are spending a lot, but not yet green. And then also you have some countries which are not spending all that much, but a lot of it is green, which we call the early promise. So that's basically just an empirical exercise, right? These are announcements that have been made. And I think what's interesting here is that Europe is a leader. Europe, with a few countries in addition, is clearly leading. This data, by the way, doesn't include the EU commitments. It's just the member states' announcements. And my understanding with our work with Oxford is once countries adopt and have their their recovery and resilience plans approved, then those become part of the tally as well, because we wanted to avoid double counting. Next slide, please. Yeah, the point of this slide, you can toggle right through, who's ever doing the slides. The point of this slide, or this part of the slide here, just keep toggling next. Yeah, there you go. Is that that little yellow bar at the top, that represents the debt increment for 2020. So in other words, we are pulling spending forward, and this is also what the EU is doing. And I know to 2058, I think is the timeline. We're pulling spending forward to give a boost right now. That just increases the urgency of making sure that it is green. Because if we are creating future liabilities, if we are creating climate risks or nature risks or pollution risks, we're doing ourselves a double disservice because we're borrowing from the future to bring it forward now. And the final slide here just talks a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. Because some countries don't have the monetary sovereignty or the capacity that Europe has or the United States has or China has. They need to, they're constrained by their ability to print money and to create fiscal space. And so again, this is too small to read, but essentially these are sovereign wealth ratings or bond ratings for countries around the world. The closer you get to zero, the closer you are to default. So you have countries like Lebanon, Argentina, which are very close to default. They don't have any space to green the recovery. They simply don't have fiscal space and they don't have monetary sovereignty. So the point of this slide is there's a lot of countries that are in a very precarious position right now. And kind of like the pandemic, it's very hard to green yourself in isolation. It's kind of hard to have a green recovery in isolation from the rest of the world. And my message here to all of you who are watching this is Europe is definitely leading, but Europe needs to bear in mind that the rest of the world is struggling to just keep themselves afloat. And that's a message that's tough, but I think it's an important message. So there is one last slide, and then Marcela, I'll hand it back to you. These are just areas, these are baskets that are really important, but as we invest in nature, as we invest in prosperity, which is infrastructure, as we invest in people, the last basket is financing. And here there's a lot of work that needs to be done to create the conditions for other countries outside of Europe, beyond Europe, to give them that fiscal space. And relative to the size of the packages that we are mobilizing, that Europe is mobilizing, that the US is mobilizing, the amount of resources needed to help those countries outside of Europe, outside of the US, are relatively small. So with that, Marcela, I will hand it back to you. It's been wonderful to learn about what's happening inside of Europe. And I think we're fighting the good fight, and I'm seeing that so much is being done. So back to you, Marcela. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. I do have a feeling, Stephen, we have only opened one lid in the kitchen of what is actually going on and what are the possibilities. But I think your presentation very well reminded the fact that we are right now in this moment in Europe, at least, with all these opportunities and how important it is to get it right. So I think this would be probably like a main message maybe that we should be taking from your presentation. Despite the fact that the time is very limited, I think we should still give a floor at least to some of the questions. We had the question which was quite rated by some participants. The issue of fossil fuels. Would it be possible to finance the fossil fuels from the RRF? I would maybe give floor to either Sabine or Paula in order to react to this question. Sabine, please, maybe.
Thank you very much, Marcela. Fossil fuel are not supported under the RRP. Only, I would say, if it's part really of the transition, there may be some derogation, but they are very limited, and they should not support a deadlock situation for the member state concerned. But I would like also to pass the floor to Paula. Maybe you want to detail this. This is applied to boilers, for instance.
You're totally right. I mean, I think your presentation responded to that when you were indicating do no significant harm, and this criteria is applied. And on my hand as well, my side as well, I mean, talking about the green transition, there is no support or for fossil-based investments unless under a very specific frame and with a transition tag on it. And as Marcela said, no lock-in effect. So this is the situation. This is why we have this twin, the green transition and the recovery. And this is why the recovery is focused on green and digital transitions. Yeah.
We also have the question on the link to the national energy plans, and I would maybe make it a little bit more general. Paula, do you have the feeling that member states really are reaching for ambition and going beyond the agreed plans, like the national energy and climate plans, for example?
Well, I think it's a bit premature to say that. We are still analyzing the plans. As I said in my presentation, the recovery is one important pot of money, but it's not the only one. I also like to say that the national energy and climate plans were drafted, were prepared and agreed, having in mind a lower ambition for 2030, so a 40% greenhouse gas emission reduction, and now we have increased this ambition. So it would be expectable that member states with the recovery plans will go beyond that. I think it's quite shy in that aspect. In some cases, we see clearly a push forward in terms of the ambition, but it doesn't come so straightforward, if I may. But still, we are in the middle of the exercise of assessment, so I think it's too early to conclude on this. But allow me to underline that there is a good consistency and coherence between the NECPs, the National Energy Climate Plans, and the recovery plans, which is something that we very much welcome, not the least on the reforms parts that come very clear out from the recovery plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have actually reached the end of our allocated time. I had more questions for Dan to bring us more positive examples of where are the opportunities for biodiversity. And I had also some questions prepared for Stephen on how the global aspect is important. But I think your presentations all have been very welcome. They have been all very informative. If you wish to learn more on the sustainable finance, I saw there were some questions. There is a dedicated session as part of the GreenWeek on the EU taxonomy, so there you can find more questions about the do no significant harm. And I hope that we will have, once these plans of member states are actually submitted and adopted, you will have a very clear picture of how have we been successful, and the member states, how they have been successful in reaching the goals and fulfilling this being mindful of this message that have been passed in the last presentation, how lucky we are that we have this opportunity to even consider the greening of our recovery. So with this, I would like to thank very much to all our participants. I hope this has been informative for everybody. And I would like to invite everybody to stay on with the GreenWeek, which is dedicated to zero pollution. And we have still some days of interesting presentations. And with this will be all from me, and good afternoon or good evening to everybody. Thank you.